I'd now like to introduce Senator Sherrod Brown. Senator Brown, a Democrat from Ohio, has dedicated his career to fighting for America's workers and preserving the dignity of work. In 2017, Senator Brown laid out his vision for improving the value of work in America and rethinking our economic policies to reflect today's realities. We look forward to learning more about the Senator's work on these critical issues. Joining Senator Brown on stage is Bob Cusack, The Hill's editor-in-chief. Bob, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Brittany. Senator, thanks for joining us again at one of our events. I want to start off, it's been about 2 months since you made the decision that surprised a lot of people, including me, that you were not going to run for president. Any regrets?
No, there's a there's a saying in the Senate that as you may have noticed, there were a lot of presidential candidates on the Democratic side this year. There's a saying in the Senate that the only cure for the presidential virus in the U.S. Senate is embalming fluid, and I'm not really kind of into that. But no, I want to take this message of dignity of work, which was really the point of our 4-state tour, and talk to colleagues and candidates. And to me, I want to see us govern. I want to see us beat Trump in 2020, and I want to see whoever the Democratic president-elect is and president is to govern more through the eyes of workers, because it's clear to me that we don't respect work and honor work in this country in terms of pay and benefits and work schedule and child care and all the other things that surround the whole issue of work.
You mentioned your tour. What were your biggest takeaways on the Dignity of Work tour?
One of the most memorable moments, I was in Laconia, New Hampshire at a child care center. And I spoke to a woman who was probably in her 60s, and she had been involved in child care, she said, since her younger brother was born when she was 2. And she's been working but she said child care needs to be seen as a public good, meaning that if we invest as a country, we invest in transportation, probably not enough. We invest in public education, in public health, probably not enough, but we see those as public investments. But you look at childcare, and childcare is something where I talk to people. A woman in Columbus in her mid-30s has 2 children under 4. She spends $30,000 a year on childcare. That is not unusual. I see people nodding their heads, probably that have a 3- and 4-year-old. So people can't afford childcare on the one end, and on the other end, people that work in childcare don't make a living wage typically. So there's something wrong with that. And I believe in capitalism, but capitalism doesn't speak to the issue of childcare. We've got to find ways of publicly invested. It probably doesn't mean what some European countries do, where the government actually builds. I don't know enough about that, but it doesn't mean the government's building big child care centers. I don't think that's politically probably palatable with the existence of Fox News in this country. But I do think that it means that we pass my child tax credit and other things that puts money in the pockets through the tax system so that people can afford child care. But you have young people, and there are a lot of people that age in this audience who are saddled with student debt. Then if they have children, and some don't or put it off because of the cost, they're then saddled with child care. And then they are trying to save as their kids get a little older. They're trying to save for college. And it just doesn't work. And we don't address those issues. I mean, to me, it's all part of the dignity of work that we don't reward people trying to do the right thing, going to school, community colleges or Ohio State or Denison or whatever, in terms of raising families and in terms of preparing the next generation very well.
In March, you announced a new plan on the value of work. This would give workers better wages, more power. Is this going to be transferred into legislation?
Yeah, we are working on a bill now to basically when companies through technology have sort of pushed people out of their jobs, understanding technology and innovation and how that happens, that the companies have some responsibility to those employees. And that's what our bill will address. So we're working on some responsibility of those employees to make sure that they have a place in this company. And it might mean that they retrain them, that the responsibility should in those cases be at least mostly on the company to make sure they can evolve into something else, be trained to something else in that company. Otherwise, I mean, workers have become too much a cost to be minimized in our country. I mean, you all know that. A lot of you are employers. I know some of you are executives with Lyft and Uber, and it's an important public policy that workers are, that we back off this minimizing, that they are just a cost to be minimized, and that workers matter. And it's a whole host of those issues of child care and wages and benefits and in retraining. I don't want to get too much into this, but 30, 40 years ago, something shifted in worker training became the government's responsibility, not the company's responsibility. I know we're not going to exactly go back to that, and I understand the public purpose of that, but there needs to be some corporate responsibility to this too.
How do you move legislation, like you mentioned, when you have the majority leader recently compared himself to the Grim Reaper, legislative Grim Reaper? Is this setting the stage for, as you mentioned, the next election, 2021? Because a lot of people think a lot of bills are actually not going to move until then.
Yeah, I mean, the leader of the Senate has one goal now, and that is to put as many very young, very far-right, very anti-choice, very anti-gay, very anti-worker, very anti-climate change legislation, to put as many young, far-right judges on the bench as possible. We spend most of our legislative day in the Senate voting on judges, and as you know, Mitch McConnell blocked an Obama Supreme Court nominee. That's the past, I understand. Don't look back too much, but they also blocked a whole lot of I'm not a lawyer, but I understand this. They blocked a whole lot of district and circuit judges too. So by the time Trump became president, there was this huge backlog of unfilled judgeships, and there is an effort in the Republican Party to get other judges, other Republican appointed judges who are older, to take what's called senior status. They can still rule from the bench, but they open up those vacancies. So this Congress in the last 3 years has ratified or confirmed more judges than I believe any 3-year period in American history. And that's because that's what McConnell does. He really has not cared much about legislating. We're not doing anything to protect people against losing their health insurance and pre-existing conditions. We're not doing anything in infrastructure. When I say infrastructure, I don't mean just highways and bridges. I mean broadband, I mean medical research, I mean all the things that come out with public health and public education and transportation with infrastructure. We're not fixing the pension system that we should be working on. We're not doing anything legislative about innovation and addressing the issues of innovation and trade. We're passing virtually nothing that we don't have to pass under, so like a farm bill expiring. So we moved on something, did that well actually bipartisanly. But we're not moving on any of the things that the House has sent over to us, almost anything that's substantive.
You've mentioned, and we'll open up for questions in the last few minutes, so think of your questions, but you've mentioned before that taxes and trade, of course, had a huge impact on the workforce. Do you think that the tax law needs to be repealed completely?
I know it won't be. I'll start with that. I think the tax law needs to be, I would start over, but I think I'd look at it this way, Bob. We shifted the tax burden, the Trump tax cut. It did a number of things, but I won't talk about all that many of them. One is literally over time, 75% of the benefits go to the wealthiest 1%, when the rich have done just fine in this country in the last 20 years. Number two, it had a special provision that they provided any company a 50% off coupon on their taxes if they move overseas. So GM, Lordstown, Ohio, they just laid off over the last 2 years, laid off 5,000 workers, and that doesn't count all the thousands of workers in the supply chain and local workers and all that. 5,000 workers. They pay a 21% tax rate there under the new Trump tax law. If they move to Mexico, and they're moving some production to Mexico, they pay 10.5%. So you start with fixing that and doing a number of other things, but I would focus instead on, I have legislation called the Working Families Tax Relief Act. It's got 45 sponsors. It expands the earned income tax credit, which means if you're making $35,000 or $40,000 a year, you will have another $1,000 or $1,500 in your pocket. It's a refundable tax credit. It helps families with small children. It helps in part address the issue of child care being a public good. It really focuses on low and middle income people, because if you give a tax cut to Bill Gates, he's not gonna buy more. But you give a tax cut to somebody making $35,000 a year, they're going to spend it in the local community. It's going to help the local hardware store and the local school district and all of that.
How should Democrats, whoever the nominee is going to be, how do Democrats win back Ohio?
They win back Ohio by, I'm a progressive by any measurement. I mean, I have an F from the NRA. I'm 100% pro-choice. I voted against the Iraq War. I hear some Democrats saying you either talk to the progressive base or you talk to workers. Well, understanding all workers aren't progressive by a long shot. But I don't, that's a false choice. I mean, to me, you run as a progressive, I mean, on civil rights, on worker rights, on gay rights, on choice, on climate change, but you also talk to workers. And I get votes in rural, small cities, rural and small towns in Ohio more than other Democrats, even though they may not like my position on guns or they may not like my position on marriage equality. But a number of them, and I don't win majorities there, but a number of them vote for me because I talk about their kids going to community college and talk about their health care and talk about pre-existing condition and issues like that. So Democrats have to get out of their mind. They need to just be the progressive. They need to talk to workers and listen to workers because Trump's betrayed workers. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that Trump has betrayed workers who trusted him to upend the system. He's done some upending, but the swamp is more dense than it ever was with the billionaire thugs around him. And we've not seen any real progress for fundamentally for workers. We still see profits going up, executive compensations exploded, workers are more and more productive, you all know that, yet wages have gone up a little bit, but mostly been stagnant.
Why don't we open it up for questions? If you have a question, please raise your hand, and we've got people with mics in the audience so for our live stream, so if you can wait until they get there. No questions? Well, let me ask you another question about, you mentioned the tax law. You had a conversation with the president about the tax law. I mean, do you have a lot of conversations? Have you had a lot of conversations with the president?
I've been with him in small groups 4 times, one in a bill signing on an opioid issue, which I helped write with my Republican colleague in Ohio, Senator Portman. 3 times in the cabinet room with 10 senators, probably 4 times on the phone. My first conversation with the president on the phone, this was 4 months after the election. It's in February or March of 2017. And the election, the conversation was about 7 minutes, and 6 of those minutes he talked about how he had won the election. And he said, I won Ohio. I said, yeah, I knew that, Mr. President. And he said, I had these big rallies. Did you go to any of my rallies in Cleveland? I said, no, Mr. President, I didn't. And I remember thinking back to my first election when I was a state legislator. I was elected to state legislature a long time ago. And I remember for like 3 days after the election, that's all I wanted to talk about. Then I realized that nobody I was talking to cared. So I stopped after 3 days. The president took him a few more months than that to figure that out. But I'm impressed by one thing talking to the president. That is, I'm just still shocked by his lack of depth of knowledge of even the issues. He cares so much about trade and infrastructure and taxes. Those are the issues. And those are the issues I've talked about. I've been with him for an hour in small groups. I've spoken up a good bit, talked about bills I'm working on, asked for his support, and his depth of knowledge is stunningly underwhelming. I mean, just stunning that the President of the United States, I mean, I didn't think George W. was the smartest president we've ever had, but I also know he had some depth of knowledge about a whole host of issues. I also remember George W., who you wouldn't have heard me say a lot of, he almost looks good to me now, but did George W., right after September 11th, went to a mosque? If you remember that, this president would never do anything like that. It's all this phony populism that, real populism is never racist, it's never anti-Semitic, it never attacks women, it doesn't give tax cuts to rich people, but he plays that divisive game that's ultimately going to cost him the election in 2020, I think. Just that continued division in name-calling, in racism and anti-Semitism.
What are your thoughts on what he's doing on trade, specifically China, and do you think the new NAFTA will pass Congress?
I call it NAFTA 1.6 because it's only marginal changes. It's not a new NAFTA.
It doesn't get to 2.0?
Yeah, it doesn't even get to 2.0. On tariffs, I assume a lot of you, since a number of you are in technology, have pretty strong views about tariffs and trade policy. And that was one of the conversations I had with him about NAFTA and tariffs. Fundamentally, the president doesn't understand the most important concept about tariffs, and that is that tariffs are a temporary tool to get to a long-term trade policy. He seems to think tariffs are the trade policy. That doesn't work to get us in the right place. It doesn't work long term. It inflicts pain on too many people in our country with no end in sight. And to me, the president started off wrong on trade. He started off by aiming the tariffs at Western Europe and Canada, instead of aligning with Western Europe and Canada and focusing the tariffs on China, which would have meant the tariffs would have been more powerful, more effective, and would not have to have been on as long, in effect as long. So I'm hopeful we still come to an agreement with China. I haven't given up hope on that. I'm just not confident that the president has done this in the most propitious way.
We have run out of time. Please thank Senator Brown for joining us this morning. I'll hand it back to Brittany.
Thanks.